Welcome. This is Brianne Lowe, State Biologist with the Indiana USDA NRCS. This is Module 2 of a 6-part series on the use of Indiana's Wildlife Habitat Evaluation Guide. Modules covering the varying cover types one may encounter when evaluating and planning wildlife habitat in Indiana will be covered through this series. If you have not viewed Module 1, Overview of the WHEG, I encourage you to start there prior to diving into the land cover modules. For Module 2, we will cover cropland settings with new habitat. This is a list of the various habitat cover types we will go over in this series. In Module 2, we will look at this farm over on the left side of your screen, looking at current row crop with a landowner interested in CP42 pollinator habitat that is approximately 75 foot wide along the road and farmstead edge. This is a typical row crop cover that we find in Indiana with no existing vegetation along any of the tract boundaries. The landowner is interested in installing the pollinator habitat along the south and east edge of the property, totaling 2.75 acres. Let's dive into how this would look in the WHEG. The WHEG tool itself is an Excel file that will be available on the Electronic Field Office Technical Guide. The first worksheet within the Excel file are the instructions and go into detail on how to define assessment areas as well as how to use the WHEG to score the habitat on the property. The first worksheet tab is the Rapid Assessment tool that was discussed in the first module. Similar to all tabs, it is possible to add the landowner name, the farm and tract number, as well as a description of the management practices that the landowner is interested in. Also include in this portion the total acres that will be installed. In this case, 2.75 acres. With the rapid assessment, as was described earlier, we are looking at habitat that is quite clear poor from the get-go. Cropland with no existing vegetative cover anywhere is not beneficial to wildlife and would get a benchmark rating of poor. We select this category, and by knowing that we will be planting either wildlife habitat, herbaceous habitat, tree or shrubs, hedgerows, or any other permanent diverse wildlife cover, we will get to a minimum planned rating of good. It is not possible using the rapid assessment tool to get to a rating of excellent. A more detailed habitat assessment is needed to look at the landscape factors as well. But for the purposes of a generalized evaluation, the rapid assessment may be used. For program purposes, by reaching that minimum planning criteria of good, this habitat would be eligible for financial assistance. Now let's take a look at the same property, but using the more detailed evaluation guide. Again, at the top, the landowner name, a description of what will be installed is all available and present. Then we will go through each of the factors and complete this based on the benchmark and the plan condition. Again, this is a cropland area with no existing habitat, so there is 0 acres of habitat on site. Our plan is to get to 2.75 acres. We look at the factors, and that will get to at least the 1 acre mark, so we're there at that 0.5 level. The width is 75 feet. Currently that's a 0 with no habitat out there, but we will get to that 0.6. Plant composition of non-cropland vegetation. Obviously, again, we are looking at there is no non-cropland vegetation out there, but if we install this habitat at the diverse native rate, we will get to a score of 1. Vegetation richness, or the number of species out there. Again, we're beginning at a baseline of 0. There is no native vegetation out there. And because we will be doing pollinator habitat, we know that we will have at least the 2 native grasses required to meet the standard, a perennial legume, as well as 5 forbs plus an additional 4 forbs within the various bloom periods for the pollinators. In this case, if you look at number or letter B here, you actually need to have at least 4 grasses out there to meet this, as well as the 9 forbs. If the landowner does not intend to plant all 4 grasses and leave it at just the 2, you would actually go with the 0.5. If the landowner is interested in a diverse grass mix to be included with the forbs, then we can jump up to that 0.75. If the mix gets even more diverse with an additional 10 species of both either grasses or forbs or legumes, we can get to the 1. In this case, the landowner is interested in a diverse mix with about 4 grasses or graminoids, which do include sedges and rushes. And we'll have the pollinator 9 forbs in various bloom periods. So we will go to a 0.75. All plantings require perennial legumes. So while there are no perennial legumes out there now, we will have one on site once the planting is complete. For vegetation management or disturbance, this is more specific to sites that have existing perennial cover. If planting into cropland and the future condition is unknown, we just go with that minimum baseline of 0.5. The current score at this time is 0 because we are in that cropland setting, or essentially bare ground, for a large portion of the year. The pesticide-free setback is important, particularly for invertebrates, and can either be incorporated within the boundary. So how far into the habitat will that pesticide-free area go where they're not spraying into the habitat itself, and is there any remaining buffer left that will not be impacted by the spray zone? Or if the landowner is willing, they can set back into their own crop field and not spray near the habitat. So either way, you're taking a look at how far into the habitat will that spray get. In the case of a 75-foot buffer, less than 50% of the area, if it was protected by a 70-foot setback, the whole area would be part of that setback, so there would be less than 25-foot setback there. But if there's at least a 25-foot setback that the landowner is willing to incorporate, you look at that 75 feet and you're going in 25 feet. That's only about a third of the area, so greater than 50% of the area would be protected by that 25 feet. So again, while there is no setback out there now, we are actually going to have more than half of the area protected by 25 feet, even if the landowner does not choose to set back into the crop field. You take the first 25 feet of the habitat where there will not be a spray boom passing over, where there is potential drift, but there will not be direct spray on, and then look at the remaining 50 feet and know that that is more than 50% of the habitat. Currently on site, there is no invasive species for factor H. And of course, we do not intend for there to be any invasive species in the planned condition. Structures for wildlife are looking at the loafing and basking habitat available, escape cover, perching habitat, roosting, and potential nesting habitat. Currently on site, there are no structures available to support these life history needs for the target species. But by planting bunch grasses, we will add some habitat for nesting, for beneficial beetles on site, so we will add at least one structure out on the site. So that concludes the primary habitat evaluation categories for this particular land unit. So now we will look at the landscape factors. You can see with the primary habitat suitability index score, our current condition is a 0, poor, as we would expect, but our plan condition is at a 0.61, so above that threshold of 0.5. Adding into those landscape factors, we can look at food resources, such as how is the diversity on the site, or is the landowner leaving standing crop or planting a food plot? In this case, it is going to look at that species richness from factor D above, and is it greater than 0.5? Plan condition, that would be a 0, but it is greater than a 0.5. We'll scroll back up to take a look. It will be greater than a 0.5 based on the diversity the landowner intends to plant in the mix. However, there will be no standing crop out in the crop field, so that we don't have that adjacent diversity in food. So while we would meet if the landowner was willing to leave that food standing or to plant a food plot, because there is not that diversity, this will still remain at a 0. Cover crops, this is specific to what the landowner has control over, so does not look at any adjacent landowners' use of cover crops. This landowner does not currently use cover crops and does not intend to into the future. Tillage, same thing. This looks at the residue that's left, the waste grain that could be potential winter food sources, as well as the soil biology and beneficial insects that come from that. The landowner currently no-tills and is going to continue to no-till. And pest management techniques. Does the landowner have an adopted written IPM plan or crop-specific IPM system or not? We know that most of our landowners are likely not to meet this category, but if they were, that is a benefit to the wildlife. So the landscape scores do not impact that primary habitat suitability index, but essentially are bonus points to what the habitat value is. These are a way to look at habitat that if in all other circumstances on that footprint are identical with species diversity, that cover types that are out there, the management that is going on, but maybe occur in different landscape settings where one may be surrounded by a field that is no-tilled, managed with cover crops, has an IPM system in place. That will be more beneficial to wildlife than a habitat system that is out isolated within a crop field setting or cropland setting or pasture setting that may have tillage or pest management that is going on that may be detrimental to the habitat. So now we can look at how these points score out. With our primary habitat score from above, you'll recall that the benchmark score was a 0, obviously a poor, and we also determined that in the rapid assessment. But the planning habitat score was a good. It was 0.61, so fell into the good category. When we add the landscape factors in there, again, it is a poor, nothing really changed with that, and it remained the same with the planned condition. This last question, will the primary habitat score improve, is looking at if that benchmark score was good and it remained good with the plan score, it is looking at the numeric change. Is there at least an increase in that numeric number? We're going to change a couple of these examples in the landscape factor to see if we can address this landscape habitat and get this to an excellent. Show you the impact of the landscape score on the rating. So let's say the landowner decides to plant at least an acre of the food plot, or at least 1/10 of an acre of a food plot, or leave that much standing crop next to their pollinator buffer. In this case, because we know that the factor D above was at that 0.75, and they're willing to leave that 1/10 of an acre, we can go to a score of 1.0 in the plan condition. For cover crops, perhaps the landowner is incorporating this as part of a resource management system and has decided to incorporate cover crops, using cover crops only after their low residue cash crops. So we'll go with the 0.5. They are already at the maximum for tillage, and perhaps this landowner has decided to implement a IPM system. By bumping those up, you can see that the plant habitat score does jump to above a 0.7, and therefore the landscape habitat suitability index jumps to an excellent. At this time, NRCS is expected to use 10% of its EQIP dollars towards wildlife habitat projects. In the event that this becomes a competitive fund pool, this is where these landscape habitat points or condition scores will be important, where there'll be ranking opportunities, and those that rank excellent will get additional points. So that landscape habitat suitability index can really help in those situations where we have similar habitat types going on the landscape, but the surrounding land uses and land management techniques may be a bigger benefit to the wildlife habitat and therefore boost the overall benefit of a particular application. More guidance will be provided in writing with the various programs and how to use these scores, but we just wanted to go over today how to look at those, how to rate those. Again, to meet planning criteria, the plant habitat suitability index needs to reach a good. The landscape score reaching a good or an excellent is sort of the bonus points, and overall, in order to be eligible for financial assistance, even if the primary habitat suitability index starts at a good, as long as the numeric number goes up, then we're providing additional benefit to the site, and we will get a yes for the does the score improve. In our next module, we will take a look at another cropland situation where there is some existing habitat out on the landscape.